Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, welcome to another episode of the Professor Game Podcast, and we have today with us Nick Yee. But before we introduce Nick, are you prepared to engage? Are you prepared, Nick?
Oh, you're asking me? I thought you were asking your audience. Yes, I am. I'm like, are you talking to me or your audience at this point? Yes, I am.
Fantastic. So, because Nick, we have him today because he is the co-founder and analytics lead of Quantic Foundry. And if you haven't heard of it, it has been over 2 decades conducting and applying research on the psychology of gaming and virtual worlds using a wide variety of methods at Stanford University. He used immersive virtual reality to explore how avatars can change the way people think and behave. How cool is that? And at the Palo Alto Research Center, he applied social network analysis and predictive analytics to examine large-scale World of Warcraft data. He was also a senior research scientist at Ubisoft's gamer behavior research group, and he combined data science and social science methods to generate actionable player insights for different game development teams. And of course, at Quantic Foundry, which is where he is now, and he is a co-founder as well, he leads the research and development of new tools for analyzing the motivations of game audiences and leverages these tools to provide actionable insights for game design, marketing, and so much more. And of course, he is also the author of the Proteus Paradox, how online games and virtual worlds changes and how they don't. So, Nick, is there anything that we missed that you might want to include in that intro of yours?
No, it's just that listening to that, makes me feel old. Like every time like someone's reading that out, it just seems such a long list. Like I'm one of these people who, was really lucky to found my passion in research and psychology of gaming really early on, like back in college, and I started running these surveys. And I've just been, really blessed to have really good mentors and colleagues to have worked with over the years.
That is absolutely fantastic. And, you were saying all these things that you've done, but today and nowadays, and even in this coronavirus environment, because I know you have a very remote type of team and work. What does a regular day with Nick look like? What does it feel to be Nick Yee in a day like today?
So Quantic Foundry is a market research practice. And so I am really passionate about talking to our clients who may be game designers, marketing folks in game companies, and helping them better understand their audience. So whether that's conducting a player segment analysis of the genre of gamers that they're in, understanding their closest competitors so they can better acquire new players towards their existing game or future game and so forth. And I think the part that I love the most is helping them understand the questions that they need to be asking and then figuring out a solution for them that's tailored for what they're looking for. And so I've been doing research in this field for about 20 years. And so it's really that tinkering process, that research process that I love the most. So on a really hands down granular level, it's chatting with clients, new clients, existing clients over web meeting. We have a blog, so we're oftentimes looking at the data set that we've collected internally and thinking of new things to blog about and share new ways that we've used the data. So, in the past, we had a recent blog post where we compared pre-COVID with post-COVID game motivation data to see if there were any changes in how people were playing games since the pandemic has started and a lot of people are sheltering in place. In the past, we've looked at visualizing game titles based on Steam Spy data using Steam meta tags. And then the other part of my time, we're looking at developing new tools or new models or new ways of understanding gamer motivation. So whether that's coming up with new analytic tools to analyze our data set, new frameworks for gaming motivations. So, we have the well-known one in the video game space, but we also have one for board games. We're also in the midst of developing one that's more generic life aspirations in general. So outside the context of gaming, but something that would apply more generally in what people value in their everyday lives. So I think those three things. So working with our clients, figuring out new ideas to blog, and also present at talks. So we have a talk pre-recorded for GDC, which is digital this year, and then coming up with new ideas and new analytic tools for gaming motivations.
That is absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure you can very quickly see why we have Nick and why he's also a very special guest for us today. And Nick, I know you've been at GDC talking. You've done some amazing work. You've created all of these profiles, all of these research tools and frameworks and methods. However, I want to go for a different time, a time of what you would maybe call your favorite fail or first attempt in learning when, creating one of these research tools or mechanisms for understanding gamers and players better. We want to, sort of be there with you. We want to perhaps learn a little bit from that experience. What can we take out of that as well, and be there with you, basically.
Sure. I think in the role of data analysis of games, and in this era where we're all swimming in too much data. So there's so many KPIs, especially in the mobile space, but even any PC console game, there are now so many server-side metrics and so many data points to look through that it really is it's a triage problem. And it's a really interesting triage problem because it kind of forces the analyst, because in a world where we all had infinite amount of time and resources to analyze why players are doing X or Y, we would have the luxury of kind of slowly combing through all the data points, but none of us do. And so the data
or the patience
problem,
even.
or the patience, yeah. And so the data analysis problem is fundamentally a triage problem, and it forces the analysts to kind of balance the time they have with their own domain intuition of the specific game genre that they're working on, of figuring out, okay, I need to answer this question. What are the variables that I should be prioritizing? And it's very much a best worst situation, right? Of what are the stabs I'm going to take, and am I going to be lucky this time or unlucky? And a lot of times we just don't know, right? Whether we were lucky or unlucky, because we don't know the paths we didn't take. But let me give you an example. The best lesson that I've learned is to be very aware of your own confirmation biases, especially when you're doing this triage. We were working with a shooter game at one point, and they had a significant churn problem in the early game. A lot of players were leaving after the first day, and this is an off-the-shelf retail box game that costs about $60 off the shelf. So these are people who were playing, buying the $60 game, playing for less than a day, and then never coming back. And there was this big segment of people who were doing that. So we started with a segment analysis based on server-side metrics. And we identified several groups of players, one of which was this high churn group. They were leaving after a day. And what we found was among this group of players, they had very poor in-game performance metrics. So they were dying a lot, they were missing a lot of their shots, they had very poor kill-death ratios, they were failing their missions a lot. And so in the first round of analysis, where we talked among the analysts ourselves, and then presented it to the stakeholders within the company, I think everyone's collective assumption at that point was that this group of players who were high churn were primarily newbies. They were new to the genre. They really didn't know what they were doing. So they were kind of like fish out of the water. They were floundering in the game, and they were trying very hard to play, but failing very miserably. And so the kind of collective reaction we had, and the solution that we felt to make sense to ameliorate this moving forward, was that we clearly needed a better tutorial for these gamers and a better way of kind of parsing them from other players, so that maybe we could kind of like put them in a remedial tutorial in this very gentle hand-holding way, and say, hey, here's another mission we'd like you to go through before we and to kind of like guide them through in this more gentle way. But kind of before we finalize that, we also wanted to run a survey of these gamers to kind of check some of these assumptions. But the starting kind of solution point in that first presentation, that was very much the story that we were telling. And so there was this kind of tension in the group at that point of, okay, is it even worth running a survey, because it would take more time, it would take additional resources trying to go through this when the findings were so clear, like all the metrics, that the differences between the groups were so stark. And it seemed like such a interpretable story that people were like, oh, don't, shouldn't we just go ahead and not worry about this? Why spend more time on this? And so there was some tension in the group, but we went ahead with the survey anyway, but it was kind of secondary and deprioritized at that point. So it took us longer than it ought to have taken us because of that deprioritization. But then about a month or two later, we got the survey data back, and what we found in the survey, we included some personality questions and some gaming motivation questions. And the survey data told the exact opposite story, which kind of shocked everyone when we finally pulled the data set together. So it turned out that this group of players who had high churn were actually genre veterans. They were very much used to playing games in the shooter
Huh.
genre. But the thing that differentiated them was that they had a very aggressive, violent, in your face gameplay style. So in shooter games, these are the gamers who are the more run and gun folks who like to be very, very aggressive. And the reason why they were failing into the game was that the game was penalizing them whenever they were not taking cover and being cautious. So the game prioritized a very cautious play style, and this group of genre veterans preferred a very aggressive play style. So the reason why they were failing wasn't because they didn't know how to play a shooter. It was because the game wasn't allowing them to play the game the way they wanted to. And so that completely
Interesting.
shifted the recommendation. So now it was clear that they didn't need a better tutorial because that was not going to help them. That would, in fact, have made them leave the game sooner because then it would have made it more clear that this was not the game for them.
It
But
was not their game for
it was
sure.
not their game. And so really what the problem was that they had a player acquisition and marketing problem, that the marketing team, for whatever reason, had decided to go for a very stereotypical shooter gamer profile rather than the profile of the gamer who was more likely to enjoy the game. And by the time that the data science team had observed the churn problem, they were so far removed from player acquisition that this was not apparent to them as being the source of the problem. And so it's really confirmation bias is this really, really, prevalent and dangerous thing. But I think it's when you look at only one source of data and you're kind of triangulating and you're fixated on that as being the story, that becomes really dangerous, particularly in the triage space for data analysis.
Absolutely, absolutely. The whole confirmation bias, and that's why smart people like Nick, not only smart, but that they dedicate their lives to thinking like a scientist. Testing out the things that we believe are just true, testing them out, see what could go wrong with them, and that's the only way, in my opinion, that he could have arrived to such a complex conclusion, because for everybody it was obvious that this is what is happening. And I'm guessing that by chance or by design you asked, well, what if it's not, what if that's not what's happening, what is really happening? We need to make that question, because otherwise we won't be able to help this game succeed. So is there anything, I don't know if I got that sort of right, actually right, or anything else you'd like to add as well?
Yeah, and I think my business colleagues, my co-founder his name is also Nick Ducheneau, and we met at the Palo Alto Research Center. He hired me as a summer intern, and that was the era of World of Warcraft where we were both exposed to this pivot point in the game industry, this really interesting pivot point where for a long time game developers did not have access to what their gamers were doing outside of their playtest groups because consoles were not connected to the internet. And so game developers had no way of getting back player metrics. And then suddenly when PC games came around, especially when MMOs, EverQuest, Ultima Online, came onto the market, suddenly we were overflowing in data. And there's this very interesting transition point. And Nick and I, we started our kind of game research careers around that era. And so I think at first we were both enchanted with this idea of, and like a lot of people were in the field, this idea of big data and KPIs and coming up with these very interesting behavioral metrics. But I think we both came to a point a few years in, and especially after having looked at a lot of games and a lot of different server-side metrics, that oftentimes these KPIs, these dashboards are really good at telling you what players are doing. So it was very clear that this group of players, they were doing very poorly, they were quitting early and never coming back. But it was much harder to kind of answer why from the server side metrics alone. And that was very much one of the reasons why we started focusing more on coming up with a model of gaming motivations, of really getting at the questions of, why are people doing what they're doing. One example is at the surface level, when you look at an MMO like World of Warcraft, you can have this super anti-social player who, in any other normal game circumstance, would not interact with other players, but they may be very power driven. So in the context of an MMO, and if they perceive that grouping up and being in a guild is the best way to level up their gear, they'll do it begrudgingly. On the KPI level, they'll look like any other normal social player, but motivationally, they're very different than someone who truly loves guilds and plays for the social aspect. And so, we were very much sensitized to like really needing triangulating using different lenses on what people are doing and why they're doing it. And so that was very much one of the reasons why we spent a lot of time coming up with the gaming motivation model.
Interesting, and maybe that's what you want to talk about, because I want to ask you about, take a 180-degree spin, and look at actually a challenge that you set up to do something and achieve it, and you actually had success, from that, whatever that was, the first or second or the nth time, whatever that looks like. We would like to know, that story as well. We would like to, maybe it's that profile that you came up with. How do you use it? I don't know. Just lead us wherever you want to.
So I think it's one of those things that seems, super obvious now, that it's important to understand why people are playing games, the gaming motivation model. And this is something that a lot of people had taken stabs at over the years. So, Richard Burrow is a well-known model. In academic papers and research, there are a lot of kind of empirically based models that researchers have tried in the game industry space. Apart from Richard Burrow, there are a lot of other models that people have developed based on intuition and their observations of gamers. So when we started Quantic Foundry, the one thing we were trying to solve, so in fact, in the gaming industry at that point, the problem wasn't that there were no gaming motivation models. It was that there were so many motivation models that everyone was kind of free to choose the one that they liked the most. And there was still this lack of a standard language around, why people were playing games. There were also two very distinct problems. One, from the academic side, was that yes, they had empirically based models based on statistics and factor analysis, which we were using, and sometimes decent sample sizes. The problem was that they tended to ask a question from a kind of clinical, bordering on pathological angle. So in a lot of these models, they would have things like problematic gaming. There was one model that had violence catharsis as a motivation, addiction scales that are built into the motivation scales, which makes sense from a clinical psychological perspective, but it's not very meaningful from a game design perspective. And then in the game industry
Not
side,
necessarily useful either.
right, especially from a pathological lens, it's unclear whether that's really a gaming motivation or whether that's completely orthogonal, that they're kind of baking too many things into the same model. On the game industry side, there was almost the opposite problem, where a lot of them were more intuition based. So there was really no empirical is a weird word. There was really no statistical reason for why the models were the way that they were, which led to this problem of they were hard to kind of validate in and of themselves. And there was no accompanying tool to measure those motivations at the way that they were proposed. And so, Richard Bottle proposed the model of the player types, but there's this player type test that other people kind of came up with to try to approximate what he was getting at. So there's all this kind of like translation problems, and it wasn't clear that the player test was really modeling what Richard was really getting at. So there were all these issues on the game industry side. And so what we tried to do was to come up with a model that made sense from a game design lens and talking about gamers, and that gamers would be interested in taking, but that was based on a large data sample, was empirically tested, that the motivations that were grouped together because for sound statistical reasons. And that's how we came up with the model. We did a large literature review of models that were proposed in the academic literature, in the gaming industry, so dozens of these models, whether they call them player types or gaming motivations, types of fun, and so forth. And then we created a large survey of these pilot questions, of questions like, how important is it for you to level up quickly in a game, to play the game at the highest level of difficulty, to chat with all the NPCs to learn their backstories. So about 70, 80 survey questions like this. And factor analysis is identifies how preferences do and do not cluster together. So it helped us understand, okay, of this bundle of 80 granular things, what are the higher level factors that group together? We created a online app where gamers would come, take this 5-minute survey and get back a report of how they scored on these motivations relative to other gamers who had taken the survey. And we slowly built up a large response set over time. So we launched in the summer of 2015. And we very quickly gathered about 150,000 gamers who'd come through and were sharing their profiles with other gamers, and those gamers would come and take the profile as well. So we had this funnel of gamers taking the app. And then we're up to 500,000 data points now. The profile app is still live. But in that first year, that first summer, was when we generated that we're able to come up with that first robust model that was very stable. It wasn't changing. And we identified these 12 distinct motivations, and we have this, online, and we talk about it a lot in our talks. So it's things like people like destruction and excitement and competition and community. So we found these 12 distinct motivations that group into 6 pairs. And so in the table where we present these results, for example, there's this action column that encompasses destruction and excitement. So gamers who care a lot about chaos and mayhem and guns and explosions, these also tend to be the gamers who prefer fast-paced action with a lot of surprises and thrills. So that's the kind of statistical logic behind the visual ordering in the table. The second column is social. So people who like competition, being in duels and matches, also tend to be the same gamers who like being on the same team and chatting and interacting with other gamers. And this social one is interesting especially if you're familiar with the MMO community and the MMO design space, that for a long time in the MMO space, people tended to have this polarized view of socialization. That on the one end, you had these very warm, fuzzy social care bears who tended to be stereotyped as being women. And on the other end, there were these kind of antisocial PvP griefers who were just kind of camping, spawn points and killing you over and over again, and were heavy into PvP, and who tended to be stereotyped as being younger men. And so for a very long time in MMO space, and you see this reflected in some...
Just in case, if you haven't heard what MMO is, it's massive multiplayer online, all right? Just to make sure everybody's on the same page.
There you go. Games like World of Warcraft and EverQuest. And so for a long time in MMO space, there was this kind of bifurcation of, in terms of gaming, there are your community care bears and your PvP competition types, and they're polar opposites. And for a very long time, that was the kind of stereotype and the model that people had in their head. And you see motivation models that reflect this polarization. But in our data set, and in other data sets that we've looked at, we found that this assumption is actually not true. It's the exact opposite, that social is social. People who enjoy being stimulated by social interaction enjoy social interaction typically in most of its forms. So whether that's chatting with other players, being in a guild, being on the same team, competing with them on a level playing field, challenging them on a leaderboard, that for them this is all social stimulation. So oftentimes, when you see games like shooters, you see competition and teamwork going kind of hand in hand. That this kind of arena play style is kind of the actual typical play form. And the bifurcation is actually the atypical form. And then it's really, you only see that in games where you have truly antisocial camping behavior. That's not so. There were older MMOs like Star Wars Galaxies, where you could entice someone to come into your home because you set up a shop, and then you could place a piece of furniture at the door and then block them in for hours until they get the customer service rep's attention to free them from your house of doom. In the old EverQuest, you could kind of, there were really tricky ways of kind of of kind of leading a group of monsters into another player, and as they were casting an area effect spell, so that the monster would all like kind of attack him at the same time. So all these antisocial ways of playing in MMOs that kind of were collectively grouped as being PvP, but spawn camping and trapping people in your house, that's not really competition. That really is just griefing, which is its own set of behavior. But in most other gaming contexts, community and competition really go hand in hand. Let me step through the other motivations real quick. So under mastery is more long-term forms of gameplay. So whether that's practicing a game over and over again so you can take on the biggest, baddest bosses and challenges in the game, or the appeal of thinking and planning ahead and making complex decisions. Under the achievement pair are different kinds of reasons for liking point systems. So whether you like points just for the sake of points, so collecting all the stars, collecting all the trophies, completing a quest, completing all the missions, as opposed to points with instrumental meaning in the context of the game in the form of power. So getting a character that's high level, getting a lot of gear with high stats. Immersion is the appeal of being in the context of the world, whether that's the psychological sense of being someone else, somewhere else. So a sense of role playing, or being part of an elaborate story with a lot of interesting characters and uncovering their background stories and their psychoses and so forth. And then the creativity pair is playing the game in the broadest sense of the word. So whether that's expressing your individuality through customizing your avatar, your spaceship, your city.
Those are two separate ones, the immersive and the creative, or is it part of the same profile?
They're under separate pairs. So under immersion is the fantasy, the role playing, and the story, and under creativity is design, this customization, and discovery, so a sense of exploration. But we've also looked at this model at one step higher. So what's the level above these six pairs? And at the highest level, the immersion creativity do cluster together. The mastery achievement pairs do cluster together, and then the action social pairs cluster together. So at the highest level, there are these kind of three big blobs, and then there's the six pairs, and then the 12 granular motivations.
That makes a lot of sense.
So when we talk with clients, with people who are doing gamification, for example, we say start at the level of granularity that makes the most sense for you. But one thing to know is that knowing nothing else about the particular audience that you're interested in, what we do know from the data that we've generated is that if any one particular motivation is the one that you're going for, or that that your audience is inherently interested in, it's the other matching pair in the pair that they're most likely also interested in. If you need to expand the features and mechanics in your game. And then one step beyond that, it's the other pair in the same three cluster bucket that they're most likely to be interested in. So if you know that your gamers are really interested in competition, then that adding teamwork and ways of chatting and chatting with other players is probably your best bet. Again, knowing nothing else about that particular audience, if you don't have the time to do the additional research, that's the next best bet. And then one step beyond that are the other motivations within the same cluster. So after competition and community, then it would be something like destruction or excitement that they would be probably most naturally inclined towards.
Interesting. And one question, because I've heard some of the profiles that people use and think of, and have you found like when you're defined as a social one, sort of competition, teamwork as well. That's who you are, or is that how you behave in a certain type of context, game, etc., or does it change? Like how does that go?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the analogy we often use is personality. So in the field of personality research, there's also this tension between stable traits and dynamic context. So example, I think that would make sense to everyone is that we all tend to be more quiet in the library and we all tend to be noisy at a party. So context clearly matters. But at the same time, we also all know people in our lives who are very clearly introverts or extroverts. That there is this, despite the fact that people's behavior change a lot across contexts, we all understand intuitively and we all experience in our daily experience with other people that people have these stable traits and they may fluctuate across different contexts, but we understand that there is this underlying trait. So in our model, we focus very much more on measuring that stable trait. But then when we work with clients, we can kind of assess gamers and ask them questions like, when you're playing game X specifically, tell me how these motivations play out. So we have a way of kind of getting at that motivation level within a particular context. But context is it's this really interesting thing, I think, and they've had a really hard time solving this in personality research because we don't have a good taxonomy of context, of what the granularity of that should even be like. In the gaming space, you can kind of say, well, maybe the context is at the genre level, that's the appropriate granularity of context that you need to go for. But it's this very kind of intractable problem in the personality space. But it's also something that we've not really addressed in the gaming space of what, when we say context, in the gaming space, do we only mean genre, or do we also mean things like genre plus the physical location that you're playing the game in, where you're playing in the family room, the living room, or your own really fancy gaming space in your bedroom and so forth. But with most of the clients that we work with, whenever they ask context, they typically mean at the genre level. And so if that's a level that they're interested in, then we can work with them to conduct a custom profiling with their gamers specifically, even, and ask their gamers, when you're playing this game X, let's walk through the gamer motivation questions and see what it looks like for you. Yeah, but that's a great question, Rob. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's at RobAlvarezB and the hashtag ProfessorGame, all one word. And in Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. Nick, is there, something that you would say, well, when you're thinking of because again, I was going to comment on like, oh, but maybe what you could be thinking is, it's not the same, this student, for example, it's not the same when he's playing World of Warcraft or Fortnite or whatever he or she is playing, and then they come in, for example, into a classroom, physical or virtual. That there might be some slight changes, but I think that is answered in what you were saying. And when you're thinking, think of somebody who is, perhaps, well, you think about this all the time. People who are maybe thinking of creating a small game, something to attract their audience, their students, their learners, or, whomever they might be interacting with. Is there any sort of tip, I don't want to call it golden silver bullet, but, something that would be maybe a best practice that you would say, well, think of these kinds of things and maybe your project could be a lot more successful?
I think in the gamification front, I think there's a tendency to focus more on competition as a mechanic, because it's the one that seems the most obvious, and it's really easy to explain to people what a leaderboard looks like. But in a lot of kind of corporate context, especially when we're talking about older folks, by older I mean even above the age of 30, in a lot of the analysis that we've run, and so we have a blog on the Quantic Foundry website where we shared a lot of the findings that we've seen and how these motivations change with age and with gender and with other demographic variables. Competition is actually the one that plummets the most with age. So by the time you get into your 30s, the appeal of competition has dropped very steeply from when we're talking about people between the ages of 18 to 25, which is where it peaks. And when we blogged that, we had a lot of gamers, older gamers, who had come in and were commenting of how, yeah, they can totally remember how they were very focused PvP, shooter gamers, when they were younger, but the appeal of that is all gone now that they're, midway through their career. They don't have the energy, they don't have the response time to play it, they don't find the competition appealing in itself. It's not very gratifying anymore. And there are other points like that, like also motivations that are more stable with age and motivations that appeal more to older gamers and so forth, that we blogged about on our website. But those are things that kind of help, in terms of, if you know your audience and the age it is, of understanding, okay, given this demographic that I have, what are some of the motivations that I'd be thinking of? But also branching out more from just thinking of leaderboard mechanics, which are often what people gravitate towards at first, of what are other mechanics that I could be thinking of. And one other way to think about it is to think about it as a coverage problem, that we know that there are these three broad clusters of motivations, to make sure that you have something in there for everyone. If you really don't know who your audience is and you don't have a sense of this is what they may prefer, to make sure that there's something in there as a mechanic or a feature under each of those three prongs. And that as you build up the features in the game, to make sure that you balance the mechanics across the three prongs. Because again, I think there's a tendency for people to develop games that reflect their own personal playstyle.
There's a past guest called Jonathan that he calls this self-hugging or something like that.
Hugging, yeah. I mean, the favorite story I like to tell. I mean, this happens all the time in the big game companies, and it's really only very recently where you've seen this changing, is what I typically call like the Chris and Evan problem, where you have these very vocal folks with very strong design senses or play styles, and they'll be dominating these design meetings to the point where the rest of the team has to start referring to those motivations in terms of the stakeholder's name. And so they'll be like, so Chris may be this very gung-ho, fast-paced PvP gamer, and he designs a game from that lens. And then the rest of the team starts saying, whenever they talk about a new feature mechanic, oh, is this a feature that that Chris would like? Because their entire design lens becomes narrowed down to specific stakeholders, around the design table, and they start building these blinders in terms of design space. And so one of the reasons why having this kind of standard taxonomy of motivation helps is that it kind of helps, instead of it being an individual ego argument, on the design table, they now have this model in a more neutral language to kind of talk about, are we sure we're covering, so when they're just focusing on, competition and excitement and destruction, to kind of have this lens of saying, oh, these all fall into this cluster. And, we're really, prioritizing this kind of gamer. Is this a gamer that we really want to prioritize? And do we want to, kind of put all our eggs in one basket, or kind of hedge our bets more? And to kind of have that discussion in a more neutral, grounded way with a more standardized taxonomy. So those are some of the things that I'd mentioned. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have a couple of these are pretty much paired questions. One is if there's anybody that you would like to listen to in an interview like this one here in this podcast in Professor Game. And the other one is if there's any favorite book that you would like to recommend this audience, and of course, why for the two of those.
Oh, that's tough. I mean, it's tough particularly for you because you've interviewed literally hundreds of people already. Like I always feel like the people I mention are people that you may already know. In fact, you mentioned Nicole Lazaro, like right before, like before we started the call. I was also thinking of, have you interviewed Jason Vandenberg?
No.
Oh, you haven't. How like how could you? But he's tough because he's so busy. But I think Jason, every GDC, well, except for this one because we're not congregating in San Francisco. But we always meet up for lunch with Jason, and Jason is just such a fascinating person because he's had this long history in doing game design. And Nick Duchesneau and I, we love talking gamer motivations with him because Nick and I, we've worked on gamer motivations more from like this data science research lens, but we don't make games ourselves. Whereas Jason makes games and he loves talking about gaming motivations, and so we love talking to Jason about gaming motivations as a lens to talk through.
Okay, so it sounds like fantastic possibility, and of course right next to your book, the book that you wrote, is there any book that you would like to recommend this audience?
I really feel, because I started my research in MMOs, and MMOs have become this entirely different thing now than when they first started in the EverQuest, the Ultima Online era. There's definitely a bit of like rose-tinted nostalgic rose-tinted glasses here, but there was a point where MMOs didn't spoon feed everything to gamers, where people kind of had to figure out the map on their own and figure out the quests on their own, and games were difficult. So you had to talk to players instead of barnstorming through a dungeon with other players without even needing to talk to them anymore in some of the more recent MMOs. And I think some of that design sensibility has been lost because of that shift. So Richard Bartle is designing virtual worlds of kind of have that sensibility of a lot of those underlying principles for what it means to design a community of people who play and talk to each other in that earlier era of MMOs. I think it's still very much applicable, and especially now that we're moving to more remote learning and having entire universities potentially being online. A lot of those ideas come back because now you have essentially this MMO of learners that you don't only have it at a classroom size, but you now have to scale it to a much larger scale. And I think a lot of those lessons are applicable in terms of what it means to scale a community and how do you deal with game design problems at a community level was a lot of things that Richard definitely talked about in his book.
Absolutely. Great book. And what would you say is your superpower in this gaming community, in this whole area of games and research in games? What would you say is that thing that you would say, well, this is what I do great. This is what I do at least better than most?
I think in the data analysis, the data research field in the gaming industry, I talked about the triage problem before, and the triage and how to triage, that intuition is something that data analysts kind of build up themselves over time. But I think the other thing that Nick and I have both realized, and I think a lot of academics tend to initially de-emphasize and deprioritize, especially amongst people in the social science fields, because we're tended to be trained to be more neutral observers, is how important game domain knowledge is in making sense of the findings. That you not only need to triage the data itself to come up with the finding, but to also bridge the finding to conveying what the underlying story is and conveying that to game designers. And the only way you can do that is being deeply steeped in gaming in a specific genre that you're working in and across genres. So you have a broad understanding of the mechanics that are possible, how the idiosyncrasies of different genres and so forth, and that domain knowledge. And it's really that weird mix that you kind of really can only build up over time, of having the, what I call the underlying chops, right? Of the underlying mechanics of doing the data analysis. That's one pillar. The triage pillar, that being quick-witted and being able to triage that problem and being able to understand, okay, here's the best place to look. And then the third pillar is that game domain knowledge. And it's that balance between those three, and having those three is something that you really don't build up on over time. And again, it's something that I've worked in the industry space from different contexts. From an academic context, we've worked with it, in fact, even with government projects, in understanding player behavior in these virtual worlds, as well as in a gaming development context, and kind of slowly building up my intuition and figuring out, which of my intuitions can I trust and are more likely to be correct, and which intuitions I shouldn't trust, and so forth. I think that's what I think I've become good at over time. But it takes time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sure it takes time, and you've invested a lot of good time into that. And you've been talking about, that domain knowledge, and, that basically means that you know about games. So this will be, an interesting question, because we would like to know, what is your favorite game?
I think in my line of work, I mean, especially, so we collect a lot of data on gamers, and one of the things we ask them is, what are some of your favorite games? And so we're constantly running across. We have a game recommendation tool as well based on that data set. So we're constantly like coming into contact with new game titles, and working with our clients. Sometimes they'll say, hey, we're interested in doing player segmentation of this game, and so it's every once in a while, if it's a game that I'm unfamiliar with, I'll go load it, and just start to play it, get a sense of the jargon and the mechanics in that game. And I play a lot of games on my own. Like, I'll discover games on Steam, or I'll learn from my friends. I'm always constantly trying to keep up with mechanics and features and trends in the game industry. But the one game that I always kind of keep coming back to, for a reason, are games in the Civilization series. So I'm currently playing a lot of Civ 6. I think it's a game that perfectly matches my play style. I like these turn-based. We had a blog post where we, in the virtual world MMO space, a lot of people who, early on, who thought that people play these games to escape, to kind of invent a new persona, and they're doing wildly different games when they're playing games. That games are where they explore and experiment. But in our data, we found the exact opposite. No, people play the games that are them. And this makes perfect sense in hindsight, right? We pick the news sources that align already with our worldviews. And it's the same thing in entertainment. We pick the shows that match our preferences, and we play the games that already are us. So people who are more extroverted prefer more fast-paced social games. People like me are more introverted. We prefer more slower-paced games. And I'm a very analytical person in my day-to-day job, and those are the kinds of games that I like to play. I like planning out things and thinking and making complex decisions and building things up over time, and that's very much Civilization. And so I play a lot of Civ 6.
Absolutely. Civ 6, Age of Empires, World of Warcraft. I'm sure many of those appeal to your personality, but lately I've been getting a lot of Civilization. It's an interesting trend right now, in how that game has sort of lasted for so well, not lasted exactly, because there's a new Civ 6.
Mm.
It's still the same game in many different ways.
I think the interesting, like, one reason why it has such broad appeal is because it lets you play both at the challenge level that you want to be playing at. So if you want a more relaxing kind of sandbox builder kind of game, you can kind of set it up for that experience. If you want a very competitive multiplayer kind of strategic game, you can kind of set it up as that experience. I tend to play it more chill because like my brain's fried at the end of the day from just working. And so I kind of take a more sandboxy kind of building up planning approach when I'm playing Civ 6. And whether you're more of a designer or whether more of a strategic builder, it kind of has those gameplays too. And there are players who kind of play it more from a storytelling perspective. They like to play the game and then tell this interesting story of their empire's rise and their relationships with their allies and their enemies, and how they finally defeated their, and so there are all these different ways of playing Civ, even though it looks like just a strategy game, but there's still these different ways of playing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Nick, we're almost out of time, but I don't want to let you go before you tell us where we can find you, where we can find all those gamer profiles and all those tools that you can have, those that are available, of course, for the audience. Anything else you want to lead us to before we say that, at least for now, it's game over?
Yeah, absolutely. So our blog is at quanticfoundry.com, where we have a lot of findings, what we've presented of data we've collected. If you're interested in taking the motivation profile for yourself, you can go to apps.quanticfoundry.com, and you can see the link for the gamer motivation profile there. We've given a lot of talks at GDC that are both on the GDC Vault, on some of their public videos, but you can also find them on YouTube if you just Google Nick Yee GDC Talks and so forth. So those are the three things I'll leave you with, Rob.
Absolutely, absolutely, very, very interesting. Again, thank you very much for your time, for being today with us. All those very interesting insights that you have given to the engagers. However, at least as I said, for now, and at least for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you here, and thank you for listening to this Professor Game podcast. And if you want more interviews with amazing, incredible guests like Nick Yee, then go to professorgame.com/subscribe, get started on our email list, and hit reply. Tell me anything. Tell me who would you want to have in the podcast. Just anything that you want, and we'll be in contact, and you'll know all the opportunities that Professor Game might be able to offer you now or in the future. And of course, don't go away to your next mission before hitting that subscribe button if you haven't in your favorite podcast app, this place where you're listening right now. And of course, go ahead and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.